Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of What Do You Think? My name is Bill Morse, and this is Oliver, of course. Today is Thursday, June 2nd, 2022, and welcome. Hope you had a good Memorial Day weekend, and had a chance to relax and ponder or reflect on on our veterans and on those who made the ultimate sacrifice or those who came back either mentally changed or physically changed. And this is a large part of the price from our foreign policy. So anyway, last week we started speaking about the Davos, Switzerland World Economic Forum Summit that took place from Monday, May 23rd until Thursday, May 26th. In Davos, Switzerland, and coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, at the same time, the World Health Organization was holding a summit meeting in Geneva. All right, also, of course, in Switzerland. And just a brief mention, the World Health Organization had been working on a treaty, a global treaty, whereby countries would sign on and relegate to the WHO, or World Health Organization, all responsibility for responding to medical emergencies, pandemics, for example. I believe this would also cover health emergencies that would stem from natural disasters, as well as viruses and biosources, biological sources. And so the idea would be states or nations would hand over a part of their sovereignty and the responsibility of reacting to pandemics or health-related issues or disasters to the WHO, with the idea that the WHO would unify the global response under one umbrella, so to speak, thereby bypassing local involvement or local decision-making, and thus adding another layer of isolation between the population, civilians, and those who take on the responsibility of making decisions that affect their lives, both in a positive way as well, obviously, in a negative way. It depends on your perspective. Well, that was about a week ago. About a week ago. And since then, nations have responded to this offer of a treaty. I believe that, Burundi in Africa responded for 46 different African nations in saying that they would pass on the treaty, that they would not participate, that they would not sign over that responsibility to the World Health Organization, that they would assume the responsibility of responding to an epidemic on their own. A number of other countries also said no thank you to the treaty. Russia, Brazil, Malaysia, India, a number of other countries. Interestingly enough, the Western industrialized nations, or what we consider the Western industrialized nations, agreed to this World Health Organization treaty. In fact, President Biden submitted 14 amendments to the treaty that his administration wanted to see included. The World Health Organization took those 14 recommendations and adopted 2 of them. I'm not sure which those 2 recommendations were, but it's now a moot point because the World Health Organization has backtracked on pushing this worldwide treaty and has said that they will rethink the notion of the treaty on technical terms and will present the world with another opportunity at signing on, the world's nations with another opportunity to sign on to this treaty, which would globalize the response to any medical emergency in 2024. So we have 2 more years before we have to face this situation again, and when they say a technical change to the treaty, that means that the intent will remain the same. That is, one authority making a decision for the entire world, and countries have to sign on to that. So we'll see. I think there's a certain level of distrust, especially in African nations where vaccines have been used to sterilize populations and where there have been side effects that have been underreported of different vaccines, and I'm not speaking just COVID, whereby there were health issues that arose once the vaccination was taken by the person. So there's a trust issue here, and so we'll see. It's a slippery slope once you give the responsibility to a non-elected group of people that basically are separated from the results of what their measures by several layers of bureaucracy. It's tough enough, in my personal opinion, to be heard in Washington, D.C. It's difficult sometimes in Montpelier, but to be heard by an organization in Geneva, it makes it much more difficult once you've signed on to an agreement and you're bound by that agreement, by that contract, and that's what this treaty is. It's a contract. So it's a large world example of what we are asked to do on a much smaller example when we sign away our right to pursue damages when we sign liability waivers in certain cases. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting. And again, in 2 more years, we will be revisiting an edited or a newer version of the World Health Organization treaty. The other thing is, the World Health Organization would also determine how long the emergency would last. and you can always find data to back a decision. And I understand that there's been controversy in Canada over the length of emergency situations, and that emergency situations or decrees are sometimes abused to lengthen a period of control exercised by the government that is normally not permitted. A suspension of civil liberties, for example, freedom of movement, freedom of medical choice as to what medicines you take without being pressured from where you work or the municipality where you live. So if you have an organization, a worldwide organization that determines how long the medical emergency lasts, well, there's a wide window there of the possibility of abuse of power. So anyway, speaking of power, I wanted to just wrap up a little bit of the discussion on the World Economic Forum, the WEF, which took place in Davos for 4 days, Monday through Thursday, and it ended on Thursday, May 26th. It was interesting to me because this was the first live, in-person meeting between these representatives from different countries and different corporate interests. Notice I say this was a meeting of corporate interests and government representatives, heads of state. And in the past 2 years, this has been on Zoom, but this was actually a meeting in Davos, a physical meeting. And this year, it was interesting. The only real head of state that showed up or that was in the program was Xi from China. There were no other heads of state. We did send our Senator Patrick Leahy over there. And he was there with other senators like Joe Manchin and a few Congress people. And they participated in the forum, which we discussed last week, called The View from Capitol Hill. And they discussed the war in the Ukraine. They also discussed the climate change, or what used to be called global warming. For some reason, it's no longer called global warming. Maybe because the world isn't warming up as quickly as we were told it would be. Global warming, and now it's climate change. And of course, that is based on the, according to the dialogue, the narrative, the production of CO2 gases from human activity. And how we can counter that and bring what has been told to us is the goal of zero carbon emissions. And so there was Ukraine climate change, and that was discussed by the senators and the Congress people. So before coming over here, and I added the one thing, and this is where I have a little trouble believing wholeheartedly what is being said. A congressman, I forget his name, but there were a few senators as well that were concerned about famine, and that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, was using food as a weapon. Not really a new concept. Anything can be used as a weapon. Germs, medicines, climate. Our weather has been weaponized. And sorry, sit down. Everything's okay. Everything's okay. Sit down, Oliver. Okay. So a couple of people were bringing up that food was being used as a weapon because, as many of us know, the Ukraine is like the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. or I should say Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe. And it has been known as the breadbasket for that region for decades. When Stalin started the movement towards collectivization of farms, and all the farms were directed from one location according to one plan. Does this sound familiar? He had his own version of the World Health Organization, centrally operated according to a plan. None of the representatives democratically elected. But anyway, when they started collectivization, they confiscated a lot of the wheat, a lot of the crops that were produced by the farmers, and left them with nothing except hunger. And so in the mid-30s, during this forced collectivization of farms, of agriculture in Ukraine, you had 5 million people die of starvation because the plan was not deviated from. It was one man had the political apparatus and the military to say this is how it's going to be done. And so Ukraine has always been connected with agriculture. Recently, it's come to light that there are precious minerals. There are minerals that are worth, that have market value in technology. And so it's a natural resource-rich country. And so it's, where the hell was I going with this? Oliver, do you know? So anyway, it's, the little history of the Ukraine. So it's been the breadbasket. And the senators and congresspeople were alarmed that Putin was using the food, withholding the food, destroying the crops, preventing their shipment out of the Ukraine through the port of Odessa, which is on the Black Sea. Turns out that mines that had been planted by the Ukrainians at harbor entrances had started appearing on beaches. These are kind of like those big water mines that you would see in old World War II pictures with this big ball, like a big bowling ball with studs, and the studs have plungers, and once you hit the plunger, the whole ball explodes. And so, and they float, and they generally are placed in for formation, and they're tethered to something as kind of like a curtain or a seawall. Well, these were not tethered. These were just planted, and many of them wound up on beaches. And it wasn't the Russians, it was the Ukrainians that had planted them. So the idea was to close the ports off, the port of Odessa, which is very important, to Russian naval vessels. So by the same token, closing them off to naval vessels from Russia also closed the ports off to container ships that would haul the wheat out of there. And so you're only getting half of the story. And my concern last week, and it's still the same concern this week, is where are the congressmen? Where are senators like Joe Manchin and Patrick Leahy? Where are they getting their news from? If their news sources is just our intelligence services, well, we're screwed. Because, in my opinion, our intelligence services, whether they're the FBI, the CIA, or even the National Security Agency, NSA, are compromised operations. They follow a political agenda. And if the political agenda is to say, is to just give one version of the story that is very in favor of one side and not in the other, then we're making assumptions. We're sending our money in the wrong direction, or we're participating where we shouldn't. So, with that in mind, I listened this afternoon to the opening to Davos, which was Monday on the 23rd, and the opening had Klaus Schwab, who is the president. He's not president. He's the executive director, I guess, of the World Economic Forum, which, by the way, has been meeting in Davos since 1971. And Klaus Schwab is an economist. He considers himself a statesman. And the idea, we talked about the Great Reset, his book, a couple of months ago in this program. And he introduced President Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, who's assumed the presidency of the Ukraine in 2014. And the premise was that President Zelensky and the people of the Ukraine have been fighting off an unprovoked invasion from Russian armed forces under the direction of President Vladimir Putin. So Putin, who's having his own personal issues, evidently battling cancer, and we're not sure if he pulled out of it or if he's even alive. I'm convinced that many of these leaders have doubles, maybe triples, doppelganger. And the Putin that we know from 20 years ago may not be the same person. Just like I know some people who question whether the Joe Biden of 10 years ago is the Joe Biden that's currently in a studio that represents the Oval Office in the White House. So we'll see. I think we're really, other than laughing, I don't know how else to react when you wonder who is the actor and who is the actual person. Who are we dealing with? Who are we seeing on the television screen? Who are we listening to? And so anyway, I listened to with quite a bit of interest to what President Zelensky had to say. He was not there personally at Davos. He was on a Zoom call. And I believe his location wasn't given, but he has been seen often with his troops, often at sites where war crimes reportedly have been committed by Russian armed forces. And he basically said that the aggression from Russia could have been prevented with preventative sanctions, that the sanctions came too little too late to deter Russia from invading the Ukraine, that actually the war had started or had been the preparation for war had started in 2014 when Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky became or was elected president. And there is some controversy as to who helped him become president in 2014. He was not a statesman. He was not in politics before. He was a stand-up comic. He gradually was an entertainer. Zelensky had his own television program in the Ukraine that was immensely popular. And so he had a very good style of delivery. He was obviously an actor. And he made connections. And some people argue that the election was rigged and that he was selected to be the Ukraine's next president because the previous president, whose name is out of my head right now, but had friendlier relations with Russia. And the logic goes that because this former president's relations with Russia were too close, that he needed to be replaced. And so he was replaced through a rigged election in 2014. And Mr. Zelensky was brought in to replace him, Mr. Zelensky having a much more pro-Western approach to governing his country and was more pro-NATO. Now, that's part of the crux of the problem was NATO. We discussed this last week. NATO expanding since the breakup of the Soviet Union, when it had given former Soviet officials the assurance that NATO would not expand once the breakup took place of the Soviet Union. But it did expand. It's now in the Baltic states. It's now in Poland. You have NATO spreading with the spread of the European Union, with the use of the euro as currency. And Putin, for whatever reason, saw this as a threat. He did not want the potential for Ukraine to become part of NATO and then be looking at possibly missiles pointed at his country from across the border. I think eventually, if there is a solution that is long-lasting, it will be for the Ukraine to become a politically neutral country. By that I mean NATO will not participate in the defense of the country, nor will Russia be allowed to set up a military presence. It will be kind of like Sweden used to be. Sweden is now joining NATO, a totally neutral country where there is no military presence. And this would be, in my opinion, a buffer zone between Russia and Europe and NATO. And NATO isn't going anywhere. It has too much support from the United States and certainly the European Union, but the bulk of the money of the support is coming from our country. So Zelensky spoke about, and I found this interesting, the sanctions should have included Russian oil embargoes and Russian banks being blocked from doing business with the West. Well, the oil embargo is kind of tricky because countries like Germany depend on oil from Russia. Russia has, like the Ukraine, is very rich in natural resources, especially energy-related natural resources. So there's lots of gas, natural gas, and lots of oil coming from Russia to Western Europe through pipelines. And so those pipelines have been shut down, and you have energy costs that are already exacerbated by inflation. We see that in this country. Now they're going to be even more exacerbated because that source of energy is gone. And Germany decommissioned its nuclear power plants. It decommissioned many of its coal-burning plants. So where's the electricity going to come from now? And they predict outages in many places in Europe, not only this coming winter, but this summer when there's a need for electricity for cooling people's homes and businesses and offices, air conditioning. So I think that's one thing to ask other countries to do, but it's not practical because who's going to suffer? It's not going to be the Russian. The Russian people are suffering from inflation just like we are, but it's not going to be a lack of energy, which is what the Western allies are going to be experiencing this coming summer and this coming winter. So practically that argument kind of falls flat as far as we should have passed sanctions against Russia before the invasion. Well, even after the invasion, it's not going to work. It's backfiring. The other idea of blocking transfers between Russian banks, well, the Russians have kind of turned their nose on, the administration has turned its nose on the petrodollar, the U.S. dollar, and now they're using Russian rubles as their currency base. And so they've bypassed the U.S. dollar entirely, and they're using Russian rubles, and that's what they're trading in right now. and that's got to really ruffle some feathers. I remember, I think the reason that Muammar Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, was executed and his government overthrown through efforts by the United States, and in particular the Obama administration, under which Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. One of the reasons that Libya was, the revolution there was subsidized by the United States, was that he was also going to go a separate way as far as currency, no longer using United States dollars as means of transactions, but he was forming an alliance with other North African countries where they would have a North African currency and they would use that in their transactions. Remember, Gaddafi had oil reserves, and so he had a major playing card in his hand, and I'm sure that was like even more fly in the ointment. So there are always dissidents. A dictator is always stepping on somebody's toes, so it wasn't hard to fund a rebel group that would topple his government and end this nonsense of not using the U.S. dollar anymore as their basic form of currency for transactions. So I believe, and I'm not alone, that was the reason his government was overthrown, because he was going off the dollar. And the United States and other Western allies wanted access to the oil. And he controlled the main valve, so to speak. So that's why and this only happened in what, 2014? Yeah. So this is about the same time Zelensky becomes president in Ukraine. So I'm just talking from the information I've come across, but given the fact that we ourselves have played dirty, what's to say that we're not helping somebody play dirty right now? And at Davos, I found it interesting that there was not one representative from the Russian government. There was not one Russian actually at the Davos summit this year. Putin actually was at a previous Davos summit, but of course the main topic was the war in the Ukraine. The second at Davos was the global warming, climate change, COVID, and preparing for the next epidemic on the agenda. And I'm not making, those are actually the words, the next epidemic on the agenda. So to me, that's a Freudian slip. The epidemics are on an agenda. They are planned. They are planned. This is no accident. This is no virus that's escaping an animal market or a biolab that's doing research. These are planned exposures. So, and then the last topic was the economy and the economy, rebuilding world economies, reducing national debt, and dealing with hunger, generally by depopulation. The debts, I see what's happening here. A country's debt would be forgiven if it handed over its decision-making power to a central bureau, which is what the World Economic Forum is advocating. One bureau that would run the world, run the supply chains, run the response to global climate change. It's falling into place that your debt will be forgiven, but here, sign this contract, and you relinquish your power, your autonomy, your sovereignty as a nation. And whether you have a democracy or not, it's not going to matter, because the decisions are not even being made in Washington, D.C. anymore. I thought one of the interesting things, getting back to Zelensky, and then we'll close, is, first off, lack of detail as to what damage has been done to the country. I have no idea, and I've done a little searching, what the harvest is going to be like in the Ukraine. It's not like the Russians have gone in and used a scorched earth policy and just burnt the fields, which is what the Germans did when they invaded the Ukraine in 1941 to starve the population. I don't believe the Russians would do that because, first of all, it would boomerang back at them. I understand that they've also had crop failures, so why would they destroy something that they could use? Also, I've seen no evidence of a scorched earth policy, although I'm sure somebody could fabricate the video footage for that. Cities being destroyed. There have been conflict points. There have been areas where there's been heavy fighting. I don't see it in the videos that people have shown from Kiev, the capital. Johnny F.D., I used to follow him. He lived in Kiev, and he's very pro Zelensky, and he's pro the government. Yet when he's walking down, you do see pictures of apartment buildings that have been hit by rocket fire. But when you're going around his area, the main downtown area, you don't see as many cars because there is gasoline shortages or rationing. But you still see people going about their business. You see restaurants open. You see a reduced level of activity, but there's activity. It's not like Berlin under siege from the Russian Red Army in late April, early May of 1945. Not that at all, though the video footage that we have been given to digest would point in that direction. So I found that the rebuilding the cities, again, no specifics, no allusion to the damage done to agriculture, and agriculture is a very big part of their economy and also feeds a good part of the world. No details. Also, I found it interesting that Zelensky made no mention of the $40 billion that the United States Senate has signed over to him. $40 billion that needs to be printed. And you know that each time money is printed and it's not backed by any value, by gold reserves, it's not backed with anything. That means inflation, the money is worth less and our inflation grows. So $40 billion. And I'm sure there's going to be, as the war continues, and I pray it doesn't, there's going to be more appeals and more handovers of large amounts of funding for not just humanitarian aid, but, and Zelensky made no bones about it, weaponry to continue the fighting. So, but the one point I'm going to leave you with, and this is it, he talked about the rebuilding effort. In fact, he talked more about the rebuilding effort after the war than he did on how to win the war, which I found it was interesting. Very little strategy discussed. And I understand that you don't want to show your hand to your enemy who's also watching the broadcast. But there was no detail as to how they had stopped the Russians, how they were pushing the Russians back, which certainly would be public information by now, and how they were getting the upper hand militarily. My guess is that they aren't, that they are being kind of corralled into pockets, and that the Russians are, whether it's uncovering evidence of attacks on native Russian enclaves, which is what the case is, allegedly in Donbass, the eastern province of the Ukraine that borders Russia. Whether it's that, whether it's evidence of bioweapons, germ warfare being manufactured If that's the case, Putin needs to show proof of that, and I mentioned that before. But I found it interesting that Zelensky did not give an update on the progress in containing or pushing back the Russians. He focused instead on after the war and how corporations / government entities could buy a patronage of a certain province in Ukraine. And I thought about this. Government agency / private corporations, multinationals, would be allowed to come in, and for a certain fee, they could have control as patron of a certain area of the Ukraine. In other words, the Ukraine would be for sale. You would have a fire sale, so to speak. And I'm sure the government, as a kind of like a real estate agent, would have its commission. The Zelensky administration, if it's still in place, would have a commission and would arrange contracts or arrange agreements whereby control of certain areas for the reason of rebuilding would be signed over to foreign government / foreign corporation interests. And so the country would be divided up, and control of the country would be sold to the highest bidder at kind of like an auction, a fire sale, under the premise of rebuilding the cities that supposedly have been destroyed, rebuilding the infrastructure that supposedly has been destroyed. And I'm not doubting that there are schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that have been affected, but not to the degree that's been reported. So I just found it interesting that, and I'm wondering if other people in the audience, of course, there was a standing ovation after President Zelensky finished his Zoom speech. If other people grabbed this, I'm sure people that, there's two ways this can go. The arms dealers are making money off the situation right now because they're asking the Ukraine Defense Forces, Asimov and other groups, what do you need? We'll make it. Here's the price. And so the arms dealers are doing very well, military-industrial complex. But after the war has kind of no longer feasible as something to milk, then there's going to be a reversal in strategies, and there will be certain, I'm sure the Russian army is not capable or interested in occupying the Ukraine, at least not beyond the Donbass Russian ethnic Russian enclave. So my belief is that there will be a stalemate. Maybe not a stalemate, but I can't see Russia occupying the Ukraine. It would be too expensive. It would expensive. It just wouldn't be the right answer. I see the neutrality coming about, or advertised neutrality. As far as military is concerned. And instead of NATO coming in, you will have corporations coming in and sponsoring or becoming the patrons of certain areas of Russia. Areas where there is agriculture, that land could be controlled by giant food processing corporations. Areas that are rich in minerals could be controlled by different technology, tech monopolies. I mean, we have no lack of international companies that are monopolies in their part of the market. And with the help of government connections and this has been going on for a long time, agreements could be made, and the rebuilding, again, the so-called rebuilding of the country could be undertaken through this type of a fire sale or natural resource sale of the Ukraine. So we'll see. I don't think the war will go beyond the summer. I think, again, I don't think Russia can sustain the war as far as its own population being okay with it. And I don't think it's in their best interest to have this situation at their border. And I think there's going to have to be some give and take because, again, Russia has its own natural resources that Western Europe needs. And the Ukraine has some of those resources, but obviously does not have the energy resources that Western Europe needs. So we'll see. Next week we'll do a pre-recorded show, and I wanted to talk a little bit about. I've got a book I'm starting to read called The Real Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, and it was written by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's the president of the Children's Health Defense Organization. And he is the son of Bobby Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1968. You know, you think things are nuts right now, chaotic in the world, and in our country, 1968. 1968 was a topper, so to speak. But anyway, later in the year, I'd like to pick up on that point, and it's really interesting how we are wrestling with issues that were out there in 1968 that were never successfully resolved. But anyway, Oliver and I thank you for listening. Thank you for watching the program. And I hope that it's planted some questions in your mind as to what's going on in not just the Ukraine, but in other places where we have foreign policy interests. And one big example is the Ukraine. And so it's that and the other issues, the climate change, the COVID response to the future responses to future COVIDs, and also in dealing with failing economies, debts that are crushing nations, and the threat of hunger because of a supply chain that doesn't work. But that's the subject for another program. In the meantime, I hope if you're able to plant some food, some vegetables that you can eat yourself, shorten your supply chain by buying locally produced products, manufactured goods when you can, and support our neighbors and support yourself, even if it's just a couple of tomato plants. I think we need to shorten the supply chain, and that starts with us here in Bellows Falls or whatever block you live on. So Oliver and I wish you a good evening, have a good weekend, and God bless. Cheers.